the MES Cities webinar program. We're delighted to have another chance to bring practitioners from cities around the world that are thinking about urban resilience and livability in new ways. And the focus of this particular webinar is on economic growth and the role of entrepreneurship and local retail in maintaining street vibrancy and all the things that make cities unique places to gather and conduct our lives. And we have a great group of folks that have agreed to participate today. We're happy to have all of you with us, and we'll have time for everyone to contribute and give us some of their insights and then have a bit of an exchange. So we're appreciative of people taking this hour. And you will now hear from Joanna the logistics of how these webinars work, and then Joanna will pass to Vin Cipolla, who's the president of MAS and the founder of the Committee for Urban Entrepreneurship, this new initiative, and he'll orient you a little bit, and then pass to Coletta, our moderator. So over to you, Joanna.
Thanks, Mary. Just a few, I can see our attendee group is growing as folks are logging on. Just a couple of housekeeping reminders. All participants are muted by default. All participants are muted by default, so you can use, there's a questions function, there's a questions box in your control panel, and you can use that for technical issues as well as to submit topical content-related questions throughout the webinar. Carol will be fielding those questions at the end. Also, if you're having trouble with your visual, if you can't see the presentation, there may be pop-ups or other windows open in front of the GoToWebinar application, so please check that first. If you're having issues with your audio, again, all participants are muted by default, but if you're not hearing us, we can put this in the chat function as well, that we have more success generally with the dial-in function. If you do use that, please mute your computer speakers to prevent feedback. So again, please submit questions using the questions box, and with that, I'll turn it over to Vin.
Thank you so much, Joanna, and welcome everybody, and happy Friday. And I know that most of the participants on this call are very aware of the Municipal Art Society of MAS and our initiative Q, the Committee for Urban Entrepreneurship. And 2 weeks ago, we just wrapped up a terrific conference called Q2Q, which some of you participated in, really looking at the issues of innovation and entrepreneurship and small business and artists and makers in cities, and concerns about growing unaffordability and harsh or difficult land use policies that can inhibit entrepreneurial activity. And so it was a terrific session, thanks to many of the people on this call, and we're very, very pleased with the progress. MAS has a very long history. We are over 120 years old. And interestingly, we've always been interested in entrepreneurship. We were founded by an entrepreneur, Evangeline Blashfield. She was an artist, lived on West 57th Street. She was concerned about the city and how it was growing up around her, and believed that it needed to be human and have a human scale and be beautiful, and that there be civic spaces. And so she and other artists collected together to really take action and got into the business of public plazas and parks and ways to make the city more beautiful and livable. And all these many, many years later, we are still on the beat of livability and resilience, and fighting for ways to make the city better. This particular effort, the Committee for Urban Entrepreneurship, grows out of some recent MAS initiatives having to do with large rezonings that had been planned in New York. A proposal to revamp New York City's garment district and create a much higher density, meaning height, oriented district there, which would have had a very negative impact in the way that it was being thought about on a vibrant private and social sector entrepreneurship environment. Similarly, in New York City in Midtown West, the area around Grand Central, where there was a proposal to upzone a multi-block area that, again, would have created a much more monocultural area of very tall buildings designed for companies with large floor plates, and those buildings would have replaced a much more diverse environment that is there today. And a most recent initiative is that grows out of MAS's work to fight for a new Penn Station, and hopefully a good result for Midtown West, which is an area definitely in need of revitalization, but we want that revitalization to be taken through the lens of really looking at diversity and entrepreneurship and innovation, not just a march of commercial and luxury high-rise development. So Q really looks at 4 areas: that of economic resilience and diversity, diversity sort of being the lead word because a more diverse community of building type, uses, people makes for a better and more livable community. We believe that deeply. Land use, zoning, and the built environment is area number 2 because the tools of land use can either facilitate or inhibit entrepreneurship and small business. Rules and regulations, how difficult is it for businesses to get rooted and thrive, and we're looking at a variety of things there, including second floor retail and other kinds of use, allowing for legal commercial activity in places right now where it would be zoned illegal, certain types of residential settings, in the overall platform of livability. So that's the structure of Q. We're very pleased and proud of the momentum of the effort and the importance of the work. And with that, I would like to turn it over to MAS Director and Knight Foundation official and Chair of the Committee for Urban Entrepreneurship, Carol Coletta.
Thanks, Vin. I think it's interesting when you talk about the origins of MAS and the desire to make a city human scale, thinking about that in terms of public assets or civic assets like parks and libraries and so forth. It's interesting that I think in the case of Q, we're really talking about human scale in a private sense and the public policy that supports that. As you point out, the land use, the zoning, the built environment, the rules and regs. And it feels to me like there is a growing rumbling, a growing tension, not only in New York, but in cities around the country, with people worried that diversity is eroding, small-scale commercial is being shut out, our streets are not as livable and lively as they once were, as bigger formats, more luxury buildings come in, and so and there's tension around that, and so I think that makes this moment very ripe for a group of people like us collected on this call to be thinking in our own cities about what can we do to make sure that our communities are economically diverse and as a result resilient. So I'm really excited about the 3 speakers we have on the call today. Robert Elmes, who is founder of Galapagos Art Space that decamped from Williamsburg, Brooklyn to Detroit, and there's been a lot of news about that, so this is going to be interesting to hear from him why New York is concerning now, and what that will look like going forward. Raj Thakkar, founder and CEO of FOREsight, Financial Services for Good, member of 10,000 Small Businesses, that initiative of Goldman Sachs, and Stacy Mitchell, who is co-director of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance and is now thinking about cities in terms of community-scaled economic initiative. Each of our presenters will do 5 slides, 8 to 10 minutes each. Then we'll have a discussion among our speakers and questions from you. Again, you can submit your questions in the chat box, and we'll look forward to getting those questions and exploring those with our speakers. So, Robert, you are up.
Hi, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Vin. Thank you, Mary. And always thank you to Mass. I'm at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Detroit, who've been gracious enough to host me here. I'd like to say thank you to them. I think my lens is going to be a very particular one. It's emerged to mid-career artists. So the function of Galapagos is to grow people from the emerged, which is to say after the beginning, up to the mid-career point. And this is what we do over and over again. New York City became for us, and you could sort of lump us, if you will, into a group of fragile cultural infrastructure, quote unquote. We found that the cost of being in New York was just simply far too high. We found that the young artists that we were presenting were shrinking in numbers, and that there was a real cause and concern in the community for where their next place was going to be that in New York City or somewhere else. Even where their next apartment was going to be. And significantly, the young artists that would traditionally have moved to New York and helped fulfill its role as the national mixing chamber for the arts in the United States were literally bouncing off the perceived cost of arriving in New York and staying instead in the regional cities, Portland, Austin, Minneapolis, St. Paul, etc. Cities that offered them the opportunity to grow into an environment bigger perhaps than the one that they came from in their smaller place, but not that national mixing chamber and that anonymity that New York City offered for so long, which I consider of extreme value, very, very, very high value to the United States as a whole. So one could argue that New York City was sort of acculturating and landing ideas and sending them on to towards the center of the country, and that California was sending skateboards back the other way. And so this role that New York had, I think, was a critical one. That role is stopping. It's ceasing. Young artists aren't able to go to New York. It's, in my opinion, frankly, a foolish venture to go to New York if you're a young artist. The best and brightest young artists won't let their work suffer just to be around the tall buildings in New York. And they completely understand that they won't have a studio in New York. If you solve your housing in some way, you're working in another industry for 40 hours a week, and you're not getting a studio. And so really it's a question of, early adopters and best and brightest, and they are looking now, I think, for somewhere else to go. Our announcement that we were moving to Detroit, I think, gave some cause and courage to the idea that you could, as a young emerged up to mid-career artist, leave New York without the sort of sense of shame that you'd come to the city and failed in some way. And looking at the incredible and outsized amount of opportunity in a city like Detroit, I think makes it very viable to think about, leaving New York or not even arriving in New York, but in fact, participating in something that's quite wide open, is asking all comers to arrive and really ask that it be contribution is your toll for coming here, and so when I look at Detroit, I see a mix of the urban agriculture. I see the arts and the 2 and 3D work. I see a lot of performance, a lot of music. And I really see the earliest adopters, the ones that you'd see in Williamsburg in the early 1990s, in East Village in the 80s, et cetera. People who want to make community, they want to collaborate, they want to create new structures. And in this case, it's very interesting because the concept of entrepreneurship is shifting, and it's incorporating urban agriculture, prototyping, 3D printing in design, so designers are able to accomplish those tools easily and quickly and work together with other folks to create ideas and objects that were out of reach just a short time ago. You can imagine a retail environment in Detroit, while having much less traffic, being 95% less expensive than New York City. If I tried to start Galapagos in New York City in this environment, as it is now, I wouldn't be able to replicate the venue, nor would the venue then be able to go on to the success and stability and contribution that it accomplished for so long, because I would have to hit the ground running within 3 months. And it took me 3 years to open the venue. And the low cost of entry gave a lot of time for me to fail and to succeed and to really understand what my role was in building the venue and in directing the venue and understanding for the venue itself what role it was going to play. And I can't imagine that I'd be able to replicate that learning curve into a 3-month or so time frame, because you burn through your funding so quickly. But in Detroit, you can really take time. I think there are 3 critical elements to a creative environment. That's time, space, and people. Arguably, New York City has people who have no time or space at this point, and Detroit has all 3, and it's really accelerating on the people component, and that's where the huge outsized values come in. I think there is a way for New York City to reapproach its role incubating emerged to mid-career artists, and there is a way to do it. In our opinion, it's an expansion of what's called the 421A housing program, which is designed to put low-income housing inside of developments. It conveniently goes across city council stakeholder territories. So it's a program that doesn't center itself on one quote arts district that every other council member would want, but goes along to something that everyone can have. And our adaptation of it would be to include ground floor cultural space inside of that model. So New York is a vertical city, and I moved there in 1989, and if it was all 2 stories taller, I wouldn't have noticed. And so if we add stories to buildings and therefore density at the high value parts up at the top of a building, for the offset of community and cultural space in the ground floor, you're going to distribute that all over New York City. It's going to be decisions made by developers who want to increase that density on the building or not. And if you run the program with DCA, there's a chance to have those marbles sort of scattered all across the city and have all kinds of infrastructure arise around those places of opportunity. But it's going to be, if that's even possible, or another program like it, it's going to take a long time, because the tide is going to start to swing out, and cities like Detroit are going to become places that are attracting young, best, and brightest. And frankly, they'll explode in the way that Williamsburg exploded in the early 2000s, where every young artist coming out of art school needed to be in Williamsburg. And it was a fascinating time. And so I think we're going to see that now in other cities, which will then feed back to New York at the post-mid-career point. Thank you.
Robert, thank you so much. If you have questions for Robert, again, you can type them into the chat box, and we're happy to have those. And so, but we'll hold that conversation until all 3 of our presenters have completed their presentations. Raj Thakkar is next, and Raj, I'm going to turn it to you.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to share the entrepreneur's point of view. 9 years ago, actually today, I launched my first company called Charter School Business Management, and next slide, please. I launched it because I saw how many educators were launching charter schools, and they had no idea, no interest in managing the finances. They were really obsessed with, as they should, on student achievement. And I couldn't believe the statistics, where there are about 7,000 charter schools nationwide, and 1 in 7 are closed, where 80% of those that are closed are because of financial mismanagement. So to me, that was a solvable problem, and I wanted to take the leap of faith to do it. I was doing this after serving as the Chief Financial Officer of Explore Charter School in Brooklyn, and they faced lots of challenges when it came to facilities. Originally, it was supposed to locate on the Lower East Side of Brooklyn, Lower East Side of Manhattan, and then ultimately landed in Brooklyn in private space, costing $1 million in facility costs, and it was just, space was such a huge issue. So when I launched the company, I originally wanted to launch it as a nonprofit, and surprisingly, lots of foundations and most people that I talked about deterred me from trying to launch, and I was surprised by at the time that that there wasn't the environment where I would get people to encourage me to do something like this. So next slide. So the startup phase was really challenging. The unknown was both very exciting and nerve-wracking as an entrepreneur. It was all about survival. Office space was not affordable. There were no co-working spaces like there are now back in 2006. It was extremely challenging with cash flow and bringing on employees. The demand for the services were huge. I had to find employees, but it was lots of risk to bring them on until I knew I could afford it. I also actively chose not to pursue loans, and very excited that the company's been profitable since day one. But things were moving so fast that the business plan felt like it was out of date as soon as it was finished. And part of what I knew I needed was education on running a business. I had my MBA in finance from NYU Stern, and back in the day in 2002 to 2002 when I was there, it was all about Wall Street. There wasn't any specialization around entrepreneurship, and higher education is just getting more and more nuanced, more and more specific as time goes on. So some ideas, next slide. Some ideas is for cities, I really recommend that cities should consider offering free or low-cost office space to entrepreneurs because ultimately it's an investment in creating more jobs, and that shouldn't be a main deterrent, as well as promoting and creating and promoting more education on running a small business well, complying with all the applicable laws. So the Goldman Sachs 10,000 Small Businesses program is an amazing free program that's, I believe, in 10 cities around the country as well as in London, and they're adding more cities as they go on. Essentially, the point of that program is to grow, to create a growth plan and describe how you're going to continue to grow your business in terms of revenues and profits, and then create more jobs, which would ultimately help the economy, and as well as learn how to pitch to potential investors and raise capital through investors so that even more growth can actually happen. About 2 years also, we applied to become, and successfully did, become a certified B Corporation. B Corporations, for those who are unfamiliar, are businesses that are using entrepreneurs who are using their businesses as a force for good, so they're impacting society in a great way, in a positive way, as well as the environment. So I would encourage governments to consider tax breaks for certified B corporations because we're impacting this society and the environment. And also initially, I would have loved to be able to reinvest our profits into more growth instead of getting taxed immediately. So perhaps some sort of period of time where there would be reduced or deferred taxes, so that could even spur on more growth. Next slide. So where do things stand now for us? Charter School Business Management, the first company, we are responsible for $500 million in public funds for 100 charter schools in the 5 boroughs of New York City. We're impacting more than 35,000 students. We employ 38 full-timers. We still have 5 vacancies for accountants and bookkeepers. We continue to grow. Very excited that we've been named one of the best places to work 3 years in a row by Crain's New York Business, and we're one of the 7 finalists for Small Business of the Year by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So lots of great, exciting news for us. Had the environment been a little bit easier in the beginning, who knows how many more jobs we could have created. And then after fully saturated the market in New York City with charter schools, last year we launched FOREsight Financial Services for Good, where we provide the same accounting, bookkeeping, financial reporting and forecasting, budgeting, and preparing for audits type services, but extending them to more than just charter schools, and extending them to nonprofits and small businesses. So now we have 20 new clients. So it's very exciting as an entrepreneur, and if Mass and Q are able to impact the way government thinks and their policies on urban entrepreneurship, there's just so much potential, so much out there that to consider. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Raj. Stacy, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here. Thanks. Well, this is great. This is a really a terrific conversation to be part of, and I'm just delighted to be able to share with you some of our thinking and research on these issues. I want to focus on the retail sector. You know, much of my research and work over the last decade has been looking at the retail sector. Retail is all about, oh, I think my slides are a little bit out of order. Retail is all about location and place, and so it's highly sensitive to all the aspects of the spatial city, planning, zoning, the built environment. I'm not sure with the slides if you're able to go to the one that was number 1, or no, that wouldn't be it, just so people aren't a little bit lost here. Keep going. Yep, this is the last one. So this is the first slide. Thank you. Oh, back one, please. Thanks. So retail is a huge sector, as well as being really, you know, as I said, very sensitive to city zoning and planning policies. It's an enormous sector. Retail, defined to include restaurants and consumer services businesses, you know, the kinds of things that line the storefronts of our local business districts, comprises almost 20% of jobs in this country and is a huge sector in terms of entrepreneurial activity. And yet, in my experience, I think city leaders generally don't give a whole lot of focused attention to the retail sector. It's often an afterthought in economic policy making. And what I want to suggest today is that cities should you know, adopt an explicit policy goal around maximizing the diversity of retail businesses, both citywide and within neighborhoods. And to me, this means that there needs to be a wide variety of different types of goods and services, especially those that meet the everyday needs of a neighborhood, as well as a diversity of ownership. Lots of locally owned and independent businesses, I think, should be an explicit policy goal of cities. We're in a kind of a strange moment, an odd moment right now in terms of the relationships of big cities to the question of independent retail versus chains. Just to sketch a little bit of the history, over the last 20 years or 25 years or so, we've seen this huge drop-off in the number of independent retailers. We've lost about a third or so of all independent businesses as suburbs and small towns have been really kind of overrun by, you know, chains, Target, Walmart, and all the rest of it. But throughout a lot of that time, our urban places, our biggest cities, were really the stronghold of independent retail. You could still go to New York and San Francisco and Chicago and find lots of independent businesses in a way that you couldn't in much of the rest of the country. Next slide, please. But now we're at this kind of funny place where local is making a little bit of a comeback. We're beginning to see this kind of renaissance. We've had over 400 new independent bookstores open in the last 5 years nationwide. We've seen this flourishing of small independent neighborhood grocers. We've got a growing number of independent fabric stores and pet supply stores. Local first and buy local campaigns have taken off in over 100 cities. There is this kind of public interest in local and independent in a way that didn't exist, you know, even just a few years ago. And yet, next slide, please. And yet this is not the case in our biggest cities. We're actually seeing sort of the reverse trend at this point. In New York, we've seen an 18% increase in the last 5 years in the number of chain stores. I was just in Washington, D.C. for a few days this week where I took these two pictures. And it was very hard actually, using Yelp and Google to even find an independent coffee shop or independent restaurant in a lot of the center city. Many of the same kinds of chains that you see everywhere. So I think we should be concerned about this trend because it really, I think, changes and I would argue diminishes our experience of the place where we live. But it also has profound social and economic impacts. Next slide, please. There's a really fascinating body of sociological research that's done in the last few years that finds that cities that have a large number of locally owned independent businesses actually score better on all kinds of measures of social capital and civic participation. People who live in neighborhoods with lots of locally owned businesses participate in community organizations in greater numbers. They vote more often. They have higher scores on things like, do you know your neighbors? What's your involvement in your community? Than people who live in places that have been become almost entirely national retailers or chains. There's a lot of different reasons that seems to be the case, but I think it's certainly a concern as we begin to think about the health of our neighborhoods and our cities going forward. There's also some really striking economic research as well. A number of studies that have been done by a firm called Civic Economics have looked at the economic impacts of local retail versus chains and have found that if you spend $100 at a locally owned business, it creates about 2.5 times as many jobs in the community than if you spend that $100 at a chain. And most of the reason doesn't have to do with the jobs within the store itself. I mean, there's that, but there are also, what they have found is that local retailers belong to this like web of economic networks that they need their accounting done, they hire a local accountant, they need a website, they hire a local web developer, they're banking at the local bank, they're advertising in a neighborhood newspaper and so on. That a lot of the money that goes into an independent retail business actually stays in the community and supports a range of other jobs. That's not the case with national chains. Other studies, there was a large-scale study done in Economic Development Quarterly a couple of years ago that found that places with lots of independent businesses have seen significantly higher household income growth. Another paper by a group of economists found lower poverty rates in places where there was a greater degree of local ownership of the retail economy. So for all of these reasons, I think cities should really focus on having a retail diversity policy agenda. At ILSR, we've been working on developing a kind of platform of city policies, and I won't share the whole thing with you today, but I'll just share a few of the things that we think are important. Next slide, please, or this may mean going back to the beginning. Perfect, thank you. So the 5 things I wanted to highlight to you today, one is the importance of really protecting, and I think Vin spoke to this very eloquently in his opening remarks, the importance of protecting historic buildings and the kind of diversity of the built environment. There was a terrific study done by the National Trust for Historic Preservation recently. They did a sort of case study of neighborhoods in different cities and found that places with a mix of buildings of different vintages, lots of old buildings, lots of small spaces, kind of incremental development over time. The neighborhoods that were like that were able to sustain much larger numbers of small businesses as well as more businesses owned by women and people of color than neighborhoods where mostly it was sort of big, new, large-scale buildings that predominated. So I think this focus that MAS has identified around the built environment and protecting that fabric is really critical. In the places where new development is necessary or does happen, one of the approaches that cities can take around independent retail is to explicitly require first floor set-asides for locally owned businesses. And this is, I think, very much akin to what Robert was talking about in terms of creating ground floor spaces that were for arts and culture. Likewise, having a policy for new development where spaces are reserved for independent businesses and are required to be priced affordably, at least initially, for businesses to get off the ground, I think is really crucial. A few places have done this. Austin, Texas, for example, had a major multi-block redevelopment downtown, and they mandated that 30% of the ground floor retail go to locally owned businesses. The developer, because they then really had to focus on that, they hired a broker who was familiar with the local market, and at the end of the day, the project ended up being over 70% locally owned businesses. Next slide, please. I think cities also need to think about ways to help businesses buy the space that they're in or create opportunities for communities to own commercial real estate. Betsy Burton, who is a bookseller in Salt Lake City, Utah, has been moving a plan through the city right now that would be a partnership between Salt Lake City, a regional bank, and the SBA to provide very low-cost loans to businesses that want to buy the building that they're in as a way to be able to control their costs, their real estate costs, rental costs over time. Another way that cities might think about going in this direction would be to foster either commercial land trusts that are community land trusts that focus on commercial buildings in the same way that we've done with affordable housing, or to encourage the creation of real estate investment cooperatives. We just ran a feature article on our website about a really interesting thing that's happened in Minneapolis in a particular neighborhood where a group of neighbors has started a commercial real estate investment cooperative, and they've bought a number of buildings in what had been a rundown commercial district and then have renovated those and have brought in local entrepreneurs to open new businesses there. What's great about this model is that as this neighborhood comes back to life and as real estate prices go up, the community is going to benefit from that gain in value, the ordinary neighbors who live there, but also they're going to be able to reserve those spaces for businesses that serve the community and that really meet community needs. Next slide, please. The fourth thing I wanted to mention is passing a retail diversity law, otherwise known as a formula business restriction. You can get the details of this and find some actual legislation on our website. The biggest city that has done this is San Francisco. About 10 years ago, they passed a formula business law. They've been expanding it and strengthening it several times over the last decade. Right now, it covers a little over half of the land area in the city where you can have that's commercial retail zone space. It's the neighborhood business districts primarily, and what the policy does is it creates a very high hurdle for chain stores to be able to come into those neighborhoods, and it really gives neighborhoods the ability to say no. And it's fascinating to look at San Francisco versus, say, Manhattan, two places that really diverged beginning about 10 years ago. Today, San Francisco has far fewer chain stores and many more independent retailers per capita than you find in Manhattan as a result of that policy. Next slide, please. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is cities, I think, can look to helping to support the creation of independent business alliances. These are organizations that have now formed in over 100 cities, running local first or buy local campaigns, bringing independent business owners together to have more of a voice in city policies. And we've been doing some survey analysis over the years and have found that these initiatives are very effective in terms of strengthening independent businesses, bringing more customers into their stores, and also helping to provide a way that business owners can have an organized voice in terms of city policy making. And for various reasons, we tend to find that these initiatives are more common in sort of smaller cities, the regional cities. They're not as well developed. There is not one, for example, in New York. I think a lot of that has to do with how challenging it is in such a big city to think about organizing independent businesses. But I think that's a challenge that, that the city or a civic organization could really help entrepreneurs meet in terms of getting something like this off the ground. So that's it for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stacy. Again, we welcome your questions, so feel free to type those in, and we will direct them to speakers. Let me begin, and Vin and Mary certainly invite you into this conversation as well. But Robert, I have a question for you. You said that creative environments need time, space, and people, and New York has people, but not time and space. It feels to me like artists, in particular those, the market you're serving, also need media. They need media attention, and certainly media is very fragmented today and more pervasive, and yet, there's still certain, I don't want to say gatekeepers, but let's say voices that are far more influential than others. And I'm wondering what you're thinking about Detroit in terms of the lack of media, and the lack of media attention that artists in Detroit may receive.
I think it's actually going to turn into a positive with a couple of years. The point being, Berlin is an example. So Berlin, for a while was where every European artist, every one smartest kid from anywhere in Europe needed to go in the early 2000s. It was the comparable, I guess, to Waynesburg. And we found quickly that collectors and curators were perfectly incentivized to go to Berlin to find new work. They're also thinking about Leipzig, and et cetera. Publications followed, blogs followed, et cetera. And the interest that curators and collectors have in new matches the interest and curiosity that artists have in new. And I think that it was received quite favorably that, Berlin became sort of a new stop on the international art map, where you would go and you would have access to, within a dense environment, exciting new work that you weren't seeing in other cities. And so I think that we're going to see that in Detroit within a couple of years. It's going to be a must-stop for people looking for things to put into their retail galleries in Soho. I mean, galleries frequently, are just simply a retail environment for art, and they need content. And if content's being produced in another city, those people are perfectly incentivized to get on an hour and 10-minute airplane and arrive in Detroit to bring it back to New York.
Robert, you and Raj both talked about cost as a factor, and you both seem to be making recommendations around how New York can be cheaper, and yet, I was just wondering, have people, who moved to New York from many, many places, I would think that New York has always been more expensive than the place they came from. Is there, do you both sense that something has changed, recently that makes New York now wildly more expensive than the places people are coming from, or is this just more of the same?
Well, Detroit, for example, if you're going to University of Michigan and their incredible, very large art department, you would then go to Chicago or New York City. When I first moved to New York in '89, I could work 2 days a week doing anything, something, and still have my career. I was a sculptor originally before I opened the venue, which I thought would give me lots of time to do my sculpture, but it didn't. As the venue took off, time evaporated. But I think that it has fundamentally changed in New York. There are low-cost environments all over the country. And gone are the days when you can roll into Port Authority at bus station in New York City with a rolled-up copy of the Village Voice under your arm and find a cheap place to live and scramble and get a job in a bar and work a couple days a week. So cost has fundamentally transformed that. If you land in Brooklyn, I think the average rent now is $3,000 or $2,800 for a one-bedroom. And you're not landing in a rent-controlled environment. You're landing squarely in the market. You don't have an inside connection to get you anything in a rent-controlled apartment. So that perception of cost, which as New Yorkers, and I'm still just from there, so I still consider myself a New Yorker at this point, we feel that cost of living in New York City. And most friends and most people that, business colleagues, were frankly afraid if they lost the apartment that they were in, they were cast somewhere out further out into the borough to a place that they had no connectivity, no group of friends, and there wasn't a next neighborhood to move on to. And so the actual cost of living in New York, the real fear of losing your community and having no idea where you were going to move to that would be affordable, just somewhere way out there, is it's a real eye-opener when you begin to look at a place like Detroit where you can buy a legitimate 5-bedroom house for $15,000. And if you don't like that one, double your budget, it's $30, and double it again, you're at $60, and your mortgage is $300 a month.
Yeah. Well, certainly that's a difference. Raj, I'm curious, in your comments you talked about, free or cheap office space, which I guess we'd all like to have, but seems terribly out of reach of most cities to provide. I mean, if you start doing that, where do you stop? And so, and I guess we'd all like not to pay taxes, but there's a reason we pay taxes to provide, for the collective good. So I'm curious, are there, do you think, and particularly in your work as part of the 10,000 small businesses, are there strategies that you believe or policies that can be, that we could adopt that would not necessarily include cheap or free or pay no taxes, but something else that would encourage your colleagues, right, that are running these 10,000 small businesses to grow and thrive in New York?
Well, I think, I was describing the ideal, and a lot of earlier it was, that would be the pie in the sky, that would be amazing, but I definitely realize that they're not totally realistic. But I think a huge part of it is financial education. In my class specifically, I was in cohort 7 at LaGuardia Community College in New York City, and I felt like the only participant in my class of 30 that felt well versed in accounting and finance. So there's so many businesses that are very passionate about their core service and or product, and there's just a lack of financial education on basic bookkeeping, on cash flow management. There's a lot of just core skills that are lacking, in any part of elementary, middle school, high school, college. You can take it, but there's just, everyone tends to be number phobic, but at the same time, numbers is really what's driving all these decisions. You have to own these numbers. So if some sort of level of financial education was required, as a prerequisite or something, I think that would be a much more realistic part of this all, because just like the charter school leaders who were passionate about student achievement, and they were like, oh, let's just figure out what these numbers look like, the same thing holds true for small businesses.
Raj?
Yes.
Okay, great. And let me, I'm going to pick up some questions now that are coming in from people who are participating on this call, and thanks to everyone for sticking with us. There's a question here: can you give your views, each of you, on best practices when one lives in an area with already high and increasingly more costly real estate values, other than moving out of the region entirely? I mean, I think each of you did address various policies you'd like to see executed. Anyone have anything to add on that?
I like what Stacy was speaking about with the community ownership of real estate. I know that Paula and Caroline Willard at 596 acres in New York City just put out a call for investors to own as a community commercial real estate, and in their first day had 450 people pledge $1,000 each. I would think it depends. If the person asking the question is an artist, I would say flee. If they're a business person, I would wonder about their ability to get involved with a community, real estate sponsored project. I think it's a wonderful project, and the community can see an increase in value of the property, and it can be refinanced later, and that can make an investment component possible for the people that are putting in the initial stages. And then for the small business owner, it can be something that they're getting a free or a discounted rent, akin to what Raj was saying, and sort of take the solution, I think, out of the government hands and put it in private, much as we're saying cities need to be resilient and the thinkers and the drivers of change, because the federal government isn't doing it. I think if we sort of scale that to our own environments, when I thought about working with small business administration, small business services in New York City, there simply wasn't a program that could in any way tackle the issues that we were facing. There was no way to cut down a rent from $30,000, to $15,000. There was no way to cut it from $50,000 to $25,000. And we were seeing rents like that for a comparable space to what we had. And if that's the case, then maybe the answer is a community-sponsored model in some way, and sort of creating a virtuous circle, virtuous loop with the different uses and stakeholders. But I would be very certain to add an investment component, which is what we're doing in Detroit. We're looking for investors that see the long curve and don't need a 5 to 7 year return, but are looking for a 10 to 15, with a high government component of tax abatements and incentives, and a small private component within that. So the community model, I think, is a pretty wide-ranging set of solutions that, if more developed, could really have an impact. And Stacy, it was interesting to hear you talk about. For me, it's a new subject, and it was very interesting to hear the depth of it that you were talking about. Does it seem like a real and feasible model?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I would sort of add is it's new in the U.S. We found this example in Minneapolis, but it's a bit more developed in Canada, both in Alberta and Nova Scotia. We found examples of community investment funds in Alberta working on real estate. In Nova Scotia, a little bit broader. Some of them were around just financing businesses and solving the credit crunch that a lot of startups and small entrepreneurs are now facing. And what's interesting in Canada, there's more policy support at both the provincial and the national level, and I think this is something we should look at. In Nova Scotia, for example, there are very generous tax credits for investors. Ordinary people who invest, say $1,000 of their savings into one of these funds can get I believe it's around a 35% tax credit, which is quite substantial. And at first I thought, well, that's never going to happen, in the U.S. Like, no state is going to do that. But as we started looking into it, we discovered that a lot of states have tax credits for investors who are putting money into, a particular kind of industry, biotech firm or something like that, and they're very generous credits. Here in Maine, we have one that's somewhere in the 30 to 35% range for investors in certain kinds of biotech businesses. We could take those credits and apply them to certain kinds of community investment trusts. And I think for me, there's a sort of larger overarching thing that needs to happen here, where cities and policymakers really need to embrace the idea that this is a policy issue, that we lose a lot in terms of the value of the places that we live, their viability for residents, sustainability issues, economic issues, if we sort of allow both independent businesses and really neighborhood-serving businesses, the hardware stores and the grocers, if you will, to disappear. And I think once cities sort of embrace that as something that is as important as affordable housing, that we have affordable commercial space, I think there are all kinds of policy approaches that could be taken and could be effective.
Our website is GalapagosDetroit.com. Is there, Stacy, a website that follows that? Is there something like, the Atlantic Nexus or something? Where is a nexus of information? Is there?
Yeah, our website is ilsr.org, or just search for Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and then click on the Independent Business section, and you can see the article about the co-ops. And also the rules section will bring you to a lot of policy solutions, the formula business restriction that San Francisco has done. All the studies that I mentioned are housed there as well, so it's a good portal to sort of finding all of this.
Stacy, let me ask you a quick question. You cited a fact more independent business has some relationship to a community with more social capital and civic participation. I don't know if you know which way the relationship flows, but I'm curious as to why you think that might be or what you know from the research.
Yeah, so there are a number of published, sociological papers that have been done on this, and they've all speculated a bit on what's causing it, but none of them definitively answer that question. And I should say these papers, of course, they're peer reviewed. They control for other factors that influence civic capital. So they isolate this question of local ownership of business. I think one of the reasons has to do with the involvement of small business owners themselves in a community. That small business owners tend to, they have both a financial and a personal stake in the place, and so they're often very active in both participating and giving to various community causes. I think one of the other issues is that there's a way that you experience your community that's different if you're running errands, your day-to-day errands involve businesses that that you're going into a business that's owned by someone who lives in your neighborhood, and you're having a conversation with a neighbor who's also standing in line. There's other research that finds that people actually engage in more conversations in local businesses than they do in large chain stores, and that there's much more relationship happening there. And so I think some of that kind of sense of connection and neighborliness makes people want to be more engaged in their community, and it creates social networks that lead people to be concerned about problems in the neighborhood that maybe don't affect them directly, but now that they're connected, they feel a need to become engaged. So I think those are some of the factors. I also think, I guess one last one that I'll mention is that there's something to be said for living in a place where the ownership is local enough that if you're faced with a crisis or a problem, you have the wherewithal to solve it yourself. That is, you have a certain amount of resources, business resources and other resources that can be directed at trying to address that problem, and you're not kind of dependent on these outside forces in terms of who controls the economy of your neighborhood.
We are at 2 minutes, and so I don't think we have time for another question, but I do want to point out that we had several questions that I'll wrap into one and then perhaps ask each of you to respond to. Mary, I'm going to ask you if you if you don't mind distributing the answer on this, if our presenters have something to say, and that is, there are some questions around crowdfunding, funding business, small business in general, new sources of funding for independent businesses, and then particularly funding for businesses for women and women of color. So I think a whole group of related questions, and if any of our presenters have comments on that, if you could send them to Mary so that we could redistribute them to those when you do the follow-up on our call. Mary or Vin, let me turn it back to one of you for closing.
I can just jump in and say that, we always see these webinars as the beginning of a conversation, and so absolutely we're delighted to do that. And if people have questions subsequently that they want to field over, the Q Initiative is carrying on. And Vin, if you're still there, would you like to say anything last around the future of the Q Initiative and what we're going to do next?
Well, I know we just have 30 seconds, so first of all, thanks to everyone, because that was a really tremendous conversation. So thank you, and thank you, Carol, for always expert moderation. Q continues. We are planning forward our efforts. We are writing up all of the good work that was done in New York. We are looking at having Q conversations in other cities because we are receiving requests, and we are distilling what we are writing up into very concrete, hopefully very concrete initiatives, tools that we can start to broadcast and hopefully advocate on.
So we've encouraged everybody who participated to stay in touch with Q and our progress on this, and of course stay in touch with MAS Cities as we continue with these webinars to have broad discussions with practitioners of all different kinds. So I'll just echo Vin's comments to thank him and Carol, and then Robert and Stacy and Raj. Great to have you guys on the webinar with us and to have us have a broader discussion beyond what we had a few weeks ago here in person in New York, and there'll be more to come. So thanks everybody for participating today.
Thank you.